ever wonder what it'd be like if someone put a gun to your head and asked you to name your favorite middle child? My ear's cold. Intervallos, commonly considered the mid parts of Limbus Company's story on account of them taking place between cantos. And I mean, yeah, you're technically right, but that's like saying potatoes are the mid part of a steak dinner. Try to erase it from the world and someone's gonna have a famine over it. Even if they aren't the main draw of Limbus Company, we have 5 smaller stories featuring the Sinners. And now that Project Moon's committed to releasing 2 per season instead of just 1, pretty soon we're gonna have more intervallos than cantos. So like any YouTuber that wants attention, I'm giving these respect by ranking them from worst to best. And then when Murder on the Warp Express comes out, my soul can finally wake in torment. That being said, it's gonna be a lot easier if we can actually quantify this score. So I'll be giving all 5 of these suckers a 1 to 5 rating on how they handle their story, the lore they introduce, and their gameplay. And considering that Project Moon is really good at writing, I'm gonna be using a bell curve for these scores. So if it looks like something is super low, know that's in comparison to what else Project Moon has made and not stories in general. But if you really want to know my take outside of PM, just add 2 or 3 to the total score and you'll get the idea. Got it? Great! I can't hear you.
So when do I rake in on the cool presents?
Presents? What presents?
In my opinion, the worst thing a Project Moon story can be is forgettable. I'd rather have a game that's painful to get through or a super long read over something that feels like it has no purpose for existing. And unfortunately, that's how I describe Miracle on District 20, which is a real shame because it has some nice ideas that it throws the Sinners into, but never commits to any of them. The story's about Heathcliff learning that his own Kanto's coming up and that'll have to meet his old flame Kathy again. So, Dawn and Dante decide to help him out by going to one of Mephistopheles' secret back doors to get some fancy clothes for him to wear. But uh-oh, it's actually a door to the outskirts and a gift factory that turns humans into presents. Shenanigans ensue. The thing is, this Intervallo has one of the stronger starts, immediately diving into the Sinners talking with each other while being incredibly bored at sea. And to me, this is where the side stories are at their best. There's no major plot from the Golden Bough that's driving the Sinners, rather, it's just them living their lives as people would. Plus, Dante, after seeing how hard Ishmael had it in SEA, wants to be more supportive of Heathcliff to be a better manager. It's all really sweet and fits into that whole Christmas vibe they're setting up. We even start to get a look into what Heathcliff is dealing with in some depth to his character once the trio's in the factory. But when the gnomes come in and show they're actually using people as ingredients, that starts a fight where you have to find a way to survive with only Heathcliff and Dawn. And quick tangent, but that was always really funny to me because I thought it would be cool to stream this when it came out using an AI Heathcliff to choose my teams, but only let me use 3 Sinners for every fight because he didn't want us to work on Christmas. But then the game says, what? You want 3 Sinners? Oh, that's cute. Have fun with just 2. And it broke the entire premise to pieces. But once the first fights are done, the story seriously falls off. Limbus dialogue is never bad, but the level of charm that I'd expect from Intervallos just isn't here after Dawn and Heath get kidnapped. And from there, the story turns into a slow grind of killing the gnome workers just to get him back. Then there's also Crayon, Domino, and the world of the outskirts, which is kind of interesting. But while I did feel for Crayon at the end, especially after Dawn tried to invite her into the city, this entire part felt more like exposition than a proper story. Or rather, it feels like this Intervallo can't choose between being a story about Heathcliff getting ready for Kathy, or a teaser for the outskirts. And that lack of focus really hurts everything after the first third. But I will give Miracle Gnomes credit for the ending, where Roja and Hong Lu start to give Heathcliff a makeover. Maybe I'm just a sucker for wholesome moments in the city, but they feel much more earned in this kind of setting, considering how macabre it can be on a regular basis. There are also a couple of nice lines and references here and there, like, it was cool to see Rudalta's aberration and story come to life, and the Santana boss fight was fine, if not a little bland. But the only reason I'd ever come back to Miracle Gnomes is if I need a reference for lore or a theory or something. So if there's one thing I can agree with Sinclair on, it's that Christmas isn't worth getting excited over in the city.
My oh my, he's a demon samurai.
Okay, look, I know some people are gonna rant at me in the comments about Yowieville being this low on the list, but before you do, let me ask you this question. What is this character's name? You know, the character that follows us throughout the entire Intervallo, nearly dies on several occasions, and commits an act of betrayal at the end? How many of you actually remember her name? So, much like Miracle Gnomes, Yield My Flesh to Claim Their Bones, also called Yowieville, suffers from a weaker main story. It's less about the most prominent character being forgotten, her name is Ongdu, by the way. It's more that what people remember from this Intervallo is individual moments that don't really connect to the story. This is an issue I noticed with Kanto 6 as well, but it's much more prominent in Yowieville. The Sinners, freshly dropped in T-Corp, are now expected to capture distortions as a part of their job and go do that while getting embroiled in the gang drama between the Kurokumo clan and the Blade lineage. It's a perfectly fine premise for a story, even if it has one drawback we'll get to later. But again, you don't really remember this story, do you? You remember seeing Dante go on fire and ramble about the light, or the bamboo-hatted Kim ID, or maybe Cayman, or the mention of Distortion Detective at the end. And don't get me wrong, all of these are nice additions, but they're not the meat of the story itself. There's someone in my circle that loves Project Moon, but isn't a huge fan of Limbus Company that I think put it best. They said that the biggest issue with Yowieville was all of the lore that we got. And at first, I thought that was really strange. It gave us a ton of answers or hints to questions that have been dangling in front of us for a long time. And piecing those together is an entire job for the PM community, so in a way, Yowieville was doing us a service. But a few months later, I started to get what they were saying. I wouldn't call the story bad by any means, but the fact that little lore moments inside of it stayed with me more than the Intervallo as a whole made it feel much more hollow. Like, what does Dante's meltdown during the chase up the Yongjin building have to do with the Blade lineage, S-Corp, or Kim? What, just that they're talking about distortions while fighting New Picatula and chasing a distortion? Sure, I guess. But when some other Intervallos have done such a good job of introducing impactful moments that are in service to the story rather than something dropped out of the blue, it feels less like foreshadowing and like we're being fed a little dog treat. And while I can enjoy a nice dog treat, an entire meal of them's not as satisfying. That being said, I think it'd be unfair to consider the plight of the Blade lineage and seeing what goes on in S-Corp as just a dog treat. But then that gets to the second reason this Intervallo feels weak. It's the only one that's not about the Sinners. Now, does a story have to be about the Sinners to be good? No, not at all. Limbus's side characters can be endearing on their own, and people loved Yuri, Samjo, and Queequeg. But if you think about it, Yuri was an exception, since she got more development than everyone except Gregor in Kanto 1, and we were still getting used to all of the characters at that point. Samjo had a chance to shine in Hell's Chicken before we properly saw him in Kanto 4, and while Queequeg is in the running for the best side character in the game, her story's only as impactful as it is because of her connection to Ishmael. All of this means that if we're not focusing on the Sinners, we have to be introduced to new characters that PM wants us to be invested in, which is a hard sell in a short story like this. We don't get as much time to really care about Ongdu or Kim before they're taken away. And as cool as bamboo-hatted Kim is made out to be, there's little room to actually see him speak or act outside of what others say about him or during his boss fight. Even if you saw bamboo-hatted Kim in Library of Ruina, that doesn't change too much here. He's more of an obstacle for the Sinners than a character in his own right. It is nice to see the tragedy of the Blade lineage as well as Ongdu's betrayal on Kim being heartbreaking in its own right, but this still falls into being an Intervallo that's more about showing something interesting than something impactful. Which again, I think it's fine for a story to be more about lore and use that as the draw, but when all three of the Intervallos that are higher on this list manage to be that and tell an emotional story, I can't really make any excuses for this one. While we're on the topic of making excuses though, credit where it's due, Sinclair does defend Ongdu near the end of the story. It's one of the few signs of bravery we've seen since his Kanto, so character growth, am I right guys? However, it would be a crime to ignore the fact that Yowieville has the best gameplay out of any Intervallo. We don't get a single node boss fight like in SEA or Miracle Gnomes, and while Time Killing Time and Yowieville have great bosses, I'd consider Yowieville to be just a bit stronger with Kim's gimmick over the Time Rippers. It only ekes it out a little since I'm counting this as a single fight rather than grinding during an event, but the entire slash theme and having to deal with Kim claiming your bones after long enough is a good time. Plus the soundtrack, absolutely slaps. But if I have that many good things to say about its gameplay, its placement here should tell you just how much this one lacked in story. While not as bad as Miracle Gnomes, it didn't feel like it committed as much to its premise as it could have. Luckily, the next spot on this list knows exactly what it is and how to deliver on the idea.
Babe, I think I'm having an episode.
Is it the beach episode?
Let's start with the Schadenfreude in the room. I feel like SEA isn't remembered for anything that takes place in the event itself. As time passed, when I hear people talking about this Intervallo, it has to do with what happened after it came out. That being the unjust firing of Project Moon artist Vel Mori. And while I don't want to get into that topic today, mainly because this happened a year ago, I do think it's worth acknowledging that since even a year later, one of Limbus Company's more noteworthy stories was overshadowed by the events in the real world. So that being said, how good is SEA? It's pretty damn solid, guys. This was made back during Limbus's short tenure of making fun of the way other gacha games handle themselves, the other primary example being the April Fool's event. So seeing them make a big deal about a Limbus Company beach episode and the happy music gave me so much life as someone who's used to the dour shit we would absolutely get from Project Moon. Like, the start of the story pulls out all the stops. The sinners are bored on the long bus ride after the events of Kanto 4 before pulling up to a shiny beachside paradise and getting excited about finally getting a vacation. The cheery music that plays and the joy on their faces just gives my slightly sadistic heart so much glee in that moment. And once the rug's pulled out from all of them and we get dropped in the swampy back streets of District 21, the spotlight then starts to go over to Ishmael, realizing that we're reaching her own story and the anxiety that causes. It's at a pretty good point in Limbus's story too, since we're now very aware that every golden bough has to do with a certain sinner, but the team hasn't come together enough to talk about what to do yet. So it's got all of the tension without the sense of camaraderie present in Miracle Gnomes. But that's enough on the set dressing. What exactly are the sinners doing here? Well, they need to go across the Great Lake of District 21 to get the next bough, and they're on a bus. So they hired a workshop to modify the bus into a boat, and hijinks ensue. From here, the Intervallo works more like a set of short stories rather than a continuous adventure. And that's a pretty good idea. It means that the sinners have to find ways to both kill time and get the materials they need to build up the bus boat. So most of this chapter is swapping between seeing the LCB interact with the recent library escapees at the Molar Boat Works, and them fighting trash crabs. These little guys that are the cockroaches of the sea and collect any sort of garbage they find onto their shells. Though while I do like the trash crabs and Limbus's trend of introducing little mascot blorbos to the side stories, they don't do too much for the combat for me. You could say they're shoehorned into the story, but I think the crabs do a good job of justifying their existence as a source of food, metal, and a way to explain U-Corp's singularity. But minus the king trash crab, they're also the only enemies we get here, which is a shame. And while the boss fight is kind of interesting, the fact there isn't a dungeon to connect it to makes the gameplay much weaker. And before you ask, yes, I was there during the days of the chicken mines, and yes, dungeons are always the better way to end these chapters. But aside from that, the small stories that take place here are some of the most charming moments in the entire game. It's not that they're more impactful than any of the main story climaxes, like when Ishmael lets go of Ahab in Kanto 5, but rather they're a nice reprieve and time we get to spend with the sinners done right. It all comes back to that slice of life energy I mentioned earlier. As a One Piece fan, I always loved seeing the small interactions between the adventures the crew had. And since Project Moon is basically Korea's One Piece, it hits that sweet spot here too. We get to see a bit of Otis's engineering skills, Merceau and Ryoshu share a moment over cooking the trash crabs, and Yi-Song tries to find gifts for his fellow sinners. Hell, Yi-Song gets his own prime moments when helping Dawn to start a volleyball game. Him playing as the team's peacemaker feels like a great cap-off to his Kanto and shows that he truly cares and is connected to his fellow sinners. And seeing the volleyball game supposed to be a moment of reprieve for everyone and it go horribly once it explodes on the nest barrier? Beautiful. Chef's kiss. And in the background of all this, we have Dante trying to talk with Ishmael about what's bothering her about District 21, only for her to get more and more panicked and upset over time. She slowly goes from only being bothered and obsessed with preparation to trying to get Dante and Verge to change course to another district, and explodes when that isn't an option. Something like this was what I was hoping we'd get for Heathcliff in one of the Season 3 Intervallos. And then we've got the fight between Heathcliff and Ishmael. We already knew that these two butted heads on a regular basis, but now with Ishmael finally bubbling over and seeing that come out in a form of primal rage was cathartic as hell. And while this may be unfair, this is one of the Intervallos that benefits from the use of voice acting, and unfortunately also the last one. Now I understand why they stopped voicing these side stories, especially now that there are 2 of them per season, but listening back to the dialogue during this fight really drove the point home. Ishmael and Heathcliff's VAs are selling it here. And then at the end, when Ishmael becomes fully hostile towards Dante and even Virgilius, it felt painful in all the right ways. She made it obscenely clear that even as she was following orders, we had totally lost her from the team in every other sense. And that state of hopelessness and unease in Dante is where we'd leave them and the game for about 4 months, leaving us to wonder what the hell she was gonna do in Kanto 5. So even if the gameplay holds it back, SEA knew exactly what it wanted to be and ran with it to such great effect for both the little moments and the story as a whole. But even if this Intervallo stuck the landing, there's one that did better, and everything a side story like this is expected to.
It's the Chicken Man!
Hell's Chicken is the funniest thing Project Moon has ever created. Do I need to say more? It's a story about the sinners getting into a fried chicken territory war where a man takes the basket of sentient raw chickens on his back and throws them onto people, which causes them to go on violent rampages. So they have to learn to cook chicken and serve it to the man to get him to calm down and stop. How the fuck did we go from the fascist prosthetic lady killing everyone Sinclair knows to a parody of Hell's Kitchen where Gregor and Ryoshu have a gang war about who's the better chef? And why does this work? Because much like SEA, the Intervallo knows exactly what it's trying to be. It's leaning into the absolute absurdity of what the city can create and allowing the sinners the space to have fun within it. It's not trying to throw lore in our faces or hype up the next Kanto, even if it succeeds indirectly at doing these things. All it cares about is making every single minute that the sinners are on screen entertaining. Like, when the sinners are approached by Samjo and one of the restaurant owners to take on the job, he convinces the team by offering them a lifetime voucher for free fried chicken, which is taking place in the middle of the streets where the people are still running amok. Ishmael's the one to point out that it's not their job to take fried chicken requests just before Faust of all people accepts it. Sure, there's extra context to that, but I couldn't stop cackling on that delivery. The momentum never lets up either. In fact, this is the only segment of any Project Moon game where I'd say you should load up the cutscenes and just watch them on YouTube. Go, do it. It's only an hour long. I'd recommend putting it at 1.5 times speed, but you'd still get to see moments like Heathcliff clucking like a chicken, the sinners arbitrarily choosing sides in this makeshift cooking war, Dawn getting scarred after seeing what Ryoshu did with a chicken kebab. What did you do to that kebab, Ryoshu? Did you hear about Yi Song's milk? Prithee, let her cook. I have not finished. Sinclair is short. Hat. Need I go on? And on top of that, this isn't just a sitcom story. All of this cooking is meant to solve a case of the distortion, which we haven't seen done so thoroughly in games up to this point, and foreshadows both how Intervallos will go in the future and Limbus becoming a distortion management company. The lore may not be at the forefront, but there's still something to chew on here that's implemented in a way that serves the story rather than detracting from it like in Yowieville. And then there's the gameplay, which you know by now I'm pro Mirror Dungeon since most players won't experience the grind during these events. And the variety of enemies we get with Bongies, Bongi K-Corp agents, and Papa Bongi several times is just enough to stay interesting. Papa Bongi's gimmick of spawning more chickens unless you can attack over a 14 with a special move is a nice touch too. Some might call it annoying, but what can I say? I like spawner bosses. Not to mention the art for the Mirror Dungeon events is just as funny as the dialogue. So what are we waiting for? Show the scores. Oh, and before I forget, I released a tier list of my favorite sinners a while back with Gregor and Sinclair at the bottom. So please, believe me when I say, guys, if you like Sinclair and especially Gregor, you should look back at this story. Gregor's the most locked in he's been since Kanto 1, or after for that matter, and gets some great lines to just show how pathetic he is. And they did the impossible and made me feel like Sinclair actually mattered for a moment when he finally talked back to his team. Hell, the little guy even got praise from Otis by the end. Seriously, I am looking for straws to grasp at to say Sinclair matters in this story. And the minute that they show he's growing without it being some ham-fisted power boost, I'll finally care about him. But hey, can we really expect that from an Intervallo? At the end of the day, these are all meant to be side stories, something light to get us from one major event in Limbus to the next. They can be a good time, but there's no way they could count as a meaningful part of the Sinner's arc, right? Alright, y'all know where I'm going with this. Play the Time Ripper theme.
It's time to kill!
What can I say about time killing time that hasn't already been said? I made a full video about how well it continued Roja's story, which is so much more than an Intervallo's expected to do. So instead, let me ask you this. After the first 4, didn't it feel like we were starting to fall into a pattern? Once again, These things would serve as a means to get from point A to point B, maybe foreshadow the next Kanto, or just give a nice small adventure. They don't have the bandwidth to be full-fledged Kanto, so no reason to expect a lot from them, right? And if we were going by this definition of just being a good time, Hell's Chicken would be the clear winner here. But then, Time Killing Time kicks down the door and says, "Yo! What if we featured all the sinners that haven't gotten as much screen time yet, and then slams a bottle of Jack on the table to show he's got not 2, not 3, but 4 different kinds of enemies to fight, and a dungeon?" At this point, I'm here for this party, taking shots like I'm living on golden time. But then TKT stands up, kicks the table over, and screams at the sky, "Hubert!" And you're so overwhelmed because why the hell did they throw in a new character just to make so much noise? And it's so loud and almost too much that the glass breaks on your windows and a bird flies onto TKT's shoulder and says knowledge you never knew you wanted to hear, like,
Distortions can be bought and sold for a fair price.
and you're just left there thinking, what the fuck does that even mean? Until finally, TKT sits you down, back on the table, and you're fully taken off guard as he says, "I've been worried about you lately, mate. You haven't been living your life to the fullest anymore. I can see it in your eyes. You're trying to stay afloat, put on a brave face, think you're making a difference. But you know you can talk to me, right? I'm TKT. Your old friend. I'm here for you." And now you're just reeling because this was supposed to be a party with sick drinks, a chirpy bird, and electro swing murder mysteries. But now everything hurts and you didn't know you could feel this way. And then after a moment of silence, TKT leaves, causing you to feel more alone than ever, knowing that you could be doing so much better, but can't face it yet. An Intervallo isn't supposed to do that. But then again, when have we as people gotten anywhere by obeying only what we're supposed to do? Story 5 out of 5. Rodion is not okay, and we got a story just as long as her Kanto here. Lore 4 out of 5. Hubert should not have worked as well as he did, but was way too endearing. Gameplay 4 out of 5. Even if Kim was a stronger fight, the Time Ripper's unforgettable, man. And now, I can only wait and hope to be broken once again when we get Murder on the Warp Express. Maybe I'll go on a real train and see which people remind me of the Lovetown characters. Or maybe I'll go out in the sun and do literally anything else. Only time will tell.